It's a terrific pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, Justin Brashares. Justin's a professor in the Department of Environmental Policy, Environmental Science, Policy and Management, and one of the very vibrant wildlife biology, Berkeley wildlife groups there. He has a group of students, postdocs, undergrads, grad students that have worked all over the world on animals ranging, as you'll hear today, from baboons and leopards to whales to coyotes and deer. And I think we'll hear a few whispers about wolves today. And I've been studying his very charismatic logo there at the bottom of the screen. He has this thing. I was trying to see the wildlife in it, looking at the blue. I saw dragons maybe, but then I finally realized what the image is, and it's extremely cool. So for those of you who are interested in a very neat design, check out the Berkeley Wildlife logo. Now, Justin, I just wanted to say a little more about why he's so special in the field of community ecology. That's the field of the study of species interactions and how they change across environments and how they feed back to influence environments. And what Justin's done, I think, first and perhaps best of most ecology is that he's incorporated humans as a real member of that interacting web. So he thinks about what wildlife alteration does to humans in direct and interesting, important indirect ways, and then what human exploitation or practices that affect wildlife in other ways are doing to their behavior. And what he can produce out of this is science and insights that lead towards a very hopeful quest, a very hopeful goal that we're all increasingly seeking these days, and that's productive, fruitful, and peaceful coexistence. What will we gain in our world if there were more predators, and how might we accommodate them? So with that, I'll thank Justin very much for talking to us about that work from Africa to California.
Mary, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's lovely to be here. That intro was so generous and such an excellent synopsis of what I do that I wish I could just end there, because I'm not sure my talk, but it's a perfect lead in actually to the things that I'll be talking about today. And I just want to quickly acknowledge, again, this audience, the folks who have come out today, and how lovely it is to talk with you. I am in my 20th year, Mary, believe it or not, my 20th year here at Cal, and I would never have made it to this point without incredible friends and mentors and colleagues, Mary being very high among them. Louise Fortman, I don't know if Louise has made it on yet. Folks like Wayne Gatz and Vince Resch and Reg Barrett and others who've been incredible sources of support through this journey. And you all know it better than most. And so, yeah, thanks to everyone, to this community. I should also mention, I'll do my disclaimer, is that I find when I give this sort of related talks, and I've been giving a few public outreach talks recently, that we very quickly, no matter what, we end up in the space of coyotes eating cats. And I'll just say, I actually gave a public outreach. I gave a much better title than this one. My title was Coyotes versus Cats. And I had 700 members of the public show up to my Zoom. You can imagine how that one went. But anyway, if we end up there at the end of the talk, I'm happy to talk about those things. And as you know, if you spend any time on Nextdoor or other places where these are the big battles of our culture, you know there's no simple solutions. But I'm happy to talk about those things. And in fact, my talk today will get to some of those issues. So I'm going to, in my 45 minutes or 43 minutes that are left today, I'm going to kind of give some broad strokes about my group and the kind of research that we do. And Mary really hit on it really nicely and more succinctly than I will, which is that we're really, as a group of community ecologists, who I call us applied community ecologists, because of, as Mary said, we're trying to connect what happens in ecosystems to what happens in society, what happens in economies, and issues of human health and justice and other factors that I'll talk about today. And really what we're trying to do, our kind of theme for our group, is identifying or highlighting these connections in nature and to society that are often overlooked, and then using stories to relate those connections to broad audiences. And we're not shy. Historically, maybe scientists shied away from the term story to describe our work. But we don't shy away from that. We acknowledge that in order to get some of these messages out and to impact policy and conservation and managers on the ground, that we need to really present this work in ways that will be acceptable and interesting. And so I'll start with a favorite. Let's see if I can get it to work. I'll start with a favorite quote of mine, which when I first read, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Well, of course, this is obviously has to be from a leading community ecologist, because it's all about, I loved it. It's geeking out on these connections in nature. It's all one fabric. But of course, this was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. writing about the legacy and the reverberations, you might say the cascading impacts of injustice and systemic racism in our society. But it really is this concept of connection that binds and illuminates the work that I'll talk about today. And as I said before, a lot of what drives me and us as a group is shedding light on connections that maybe often escape notice. And I'm going to give some examples, and I want to make sure that I give credit and highlight the contributions of students, both current and recently graduated, because as you all know, so much of what we do and so much of what makes our campus special is the contribution of these amazing young minds. And so just some examples of these kind of invisible linkages across our planet that we work as a group to illuminate. One of those is thinking about how humans have altered the behavior of wildlife across our planet. And this is work that we endeavored to show, or we tested and were able to show how so many species on Earth are shifting towards becoming more nocturnal as a way to avoid humans. We also study other forms of somewhat, you might say, invisible interactors in our ecosystems. And one of those is fences. And if any of you look out of your window right now, there's a very high probability you will see a fence. There's also a pretty good chance you may not have thought much about that fence. And in fact, that describes much of our planet. There's a whole field, the field of road ecology, that studies how highways and roads have influenced ecosystems. And in that field, they'll often highlight the fact that there's enough roads on our planet to reach the moon and back. But I'll point out that there's enough fencing on our planet to reach the sun and back. And so our planet is crisscrossed by millions and millions of miles of fencing. And until very recently, we've done almost no scientific work to think about how that fencing changes our landscapes, how it changes how animals move across that landscape, or processes like fire or disease or other factors. And so that's another one of these invisible dynamics that we try and illuminate as a group. Recent graduate Kendall Calhoun has led our efforts to understand how fire and the recent expansion and impact of megafire, particularly in California, has influenced wildlife communities and also the response of vegetation. And so that's, megafire is certainly not invisible in California. We're very aware of it, but we have much weaker understanding or poorer understanding about what are the outcomes or ultimate consequences of these incredibly hot, severe, and far-reaching fires. And then a project that Mary is a collaborator on and knows quite well is one that shouldn't be invisible, but which is trying to understand what this legalization of cannabis in California and in many other Western states, trying to understand what that has meant for the environment. How has that impacted the environment? Are we paying attention, and do we understand what might be the consequences, good and bad, of that? And finally, our group doesn't shy away from big policy. And you may be aware of the 30 by 30 movement, which is an effort to conserve 30% of land and sea by the year 2030. It's encapsulated within President Biden's America the Beautiful legislation and other legislation. And working with students like Millie Chapman and my collaborator, Arthur Middleton, we've engaged in a lot of policy work to try and understand what does it mean to rapidly expand the amount of area under conservation or under protection, both at land and sea, and who gets to make those decisions about what's important and who's involved, basically who is sitting at that table. And there is a lot that is invisible, as well known as this movement is, and some call it, I think fairly, a conservation revolution. We ask, I think, important questions about what's going on under the surface. And within all of this, we are increasingly engaging indigenous groups, and in part in recognition of the fact that whether it's managing fire or thinking about connected landscapes or thinking about this incredible fabric of life to which we are intricately bound, we're recognizing that these are very old ideas. In fact, this is a concept of nature and human involvement that goes back thousands of years. And unfortunately, it's taken us quite a while as a scientific community to listen and acknowledge that the indigenous communities, including the communities in California, like the Karuk and Yurok, Upa tribes, have been working and thinking at this level of interaction and connectivity for millennia. And so for the rest of today, I'm going to jump into a couple examples of how we bring this lens of connectivity within ecosystems to kind of move from an individual animal or a species to thinking about a community, and then thinking about how that community can be extended to include humans, as Mary said. And I'll start with work that we've been doing for now couple decades with collaborators in West Africa, mostly in the country of Ghana. And then I'll jump to some very, very new work in California that will be more describing this work and what we're setting out to do, more than presenting much in the way of results. And generally, my talk is going to be light on data, just a few data slides, but please feel free to push me on anything or ask. And I'm also happy to share manuscripts or other things if you'd like to learn more. And as I move from West Africa to California, you'll see there are a lot of similarities in the stories that I'll tell and the science that I'll describe. And they are both very much about these great challenges of large carnivore decline, but also the complications of large carnivore recovery. And so that story starts with, as you know, the debate really that has gone on and that Mary has been very much a part of, and others here may have been a part of as well, the debate about the role of predators in ecosystems. And if you followed the science and stories coming out of, for example, the restoration recovery of wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, you know that there's examples and science and storytelling around the positive benefits of large carnivores for whole ecosystems, such as the wolf. But there's also, of course, a lot of challenges and uncertainty that these predators bring to ecosystems. And the reality of their recovery and return is a pretty mixed bag. A project that Mary and I worked closely on with our dear colleague, Jim Estes, was, and many others, summarize some of these impacts of predators on whole ecosystems across the planet. And what we see, whether it's sea otters on our coasts or sharks or wolves or even Arctic foxes or other things, is that these predators have the potential to alter the whole fabric, the whole structure of ecosystems through their role, both in regulating prey populations, but also, as I'll touch on, through indirect effects by, for example, creating fear in prey that then alters the behavior of those prey in ways that cascade through ecosystems. And again, this is the premise on which I'll describe, or I'll start this one case study from our work in Ghana and West Africa. And some of you, I'll bet, have been to Ghana. It's a country that's almost the same size as our state of Oregon. And it's a rich, more than 23 languages are spoken in that small area, and obviously rich history, an incredible diversity of culture and of flora and fauna. And our work in Ghana really focuses on 6 protected areas that are indicated here in black with these red outlines. And what's made our work possible, and this is work in collaboration with the Ghana Wildlife Division, what's made that work possible is that the Ghana Wildlife Division has been surveying large animals, wildlife, in these parks since the 1950s. And this has been really a remarkable wildlife monitoring program in that every month groups of rangers head out on designated transects and record all of the animals that they see. And then these data are recorded and made available to researchers such as myself. And there's many reasons why this is special. The length of time that this monitoring has occurred, the high level of rigor, and also the intensity of sampling, but also the fact that it has included more than 40 species. So through these data, we're able to gain insight on real changes in wildlife populations over time. And we, as a research group and with our partners, have also added to this data set. We've added new sites, we've added additional kinds of monitoring. And if any of you have played with these camera traps in your backyards or other things, I'll warn you, you get a lot of raccoons. And if you have a backyard pond, you get a lot of raccoons doing a lot of evil things to your pond. But anyway, these are the kinds of information we can gain from remote cameras that also give us information on the presence and absence and even trends over time of wildlife. And the overwhelming and sad story from these long-term data sets from Ghana is that one group in particular of wildlife has been most negatively impacted over time, and that's these large carnivores. And specifically in these West African protected areas, it's lions, spotted hyenas, leopards, and the African wild dog, which is now pretty much extinct in the region. And we've taken this time series of data just to 2000, in part because though we've continued this monitoring to today, we haven't come up any higher than where we were in 2000. And in fact, the trend, the number of large carnivores in these protected areas, in these parks, has steadily declined or has continued declined to near extinction levels. So there's lots of obvious concern and challenges associated with this decline of these apex predators, these top carnivores in these ecosystems. And one of the things that we were interested in trying to understand is what are the factors that drove the loss of these species in the first place? And one of our more surprising findings was that we actually could learn a lot in understanding the loss of wildlife on land by understanding the trends of wildlife in the ocean, and specifically by understanding the amount of fish that were available to people. And so really what we saw, and this was what we were basically told by local communities and others, is they said, when fish are abundant and available, they eat fish, they buy and eat fish. When fish are scarce or they become too expensive, and communities buy terrestrial wildlife, which is often called bushmeat, and you may have heard that term. And these are just to show you some examples of monitoring markets in West Africa that sell both fish and wildlife. We see this clear relationship where when there's a lot of fish in the market, people buy much less wildlife, and that includes large carnivores and primates and other kinds of terrestrial or land animals. These are just more different relationships showing that same trend, that when there's a lot of fish over here on the right side of this second graph, then there's a lot less hunting in these reserves, in these protected areas. And then finally, this is the same bottom axis, just showing that when their fish are very abundant and very available, that we actually can detect increases in the population of these large carnivores and other large mammal species. So basically what we're seeing is that one of the biggest predictors of the decline or changes in the abundance of wildlife on land is the availability of fish along coasts. So now going back to these large carnivores, there is hunting and wildlife consumption across this region, as there is through most of the world. So why are large carnivores hit particularly hard by these human impacts? And the reason are that these large carnivores are hunted, they're consumed. They're consumed. They're also targeted because of the threat that they pose to people and livestock. So they're poisoned and shot. Large carnivores, these big predators, are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of being isolated in small protected areas. They need large areas to roam. So if they get fenced in, they decline quickly. And then finally, these large carnivores, these large predators, are very vulnerable to the loss of their prey. So in cases where other species decline, these animals may simply starve or be forced to take greater risks in trying to eat livestock, or other things, trash or other things that get them in trouble with humans. And so this long-term decline, of course, ecologically or from a conservation or from a cultural perspective, these are concerning and a really big issue. But as an ecologist and as a community ecologist, I was particularly interested in understanding what it might mean for other species in this wildlife community that no longer have to really engage or interact with these large predators. And the species that we all felt was most likely to benefit from the loss of these large predators was the baboon, the olive baboon. And there's lots of science showing that baboons are often, their populations are controlled by large carnivores, particularly lions and also leopards. But what's even more well documented, and something that we've documented and researched as well, is the fact that baboons are incredibly sensitive to the presence of large carnivores, so much so that baboons won't leave trees where they can escape large carnivores if there's a carnivore even in the remote area. And so this sort of behavioral impact, this sort of fear effect, as it's often called, has potentially profound impacts on the ability of baboons to forage widely, and therefore for their populations to grow. And in fact, what we saw over time in all of these protected areas is that as large carnivore numbers declined, baboon populations increased. And in some cases, almost in multiples of four or five times. And so we really did see, and of course, this was something that we could see with our eyes as well, and traveling to these communities and to these protected areas. But what we could see in the numbers as well is this incredible ecological eruption of baboons. And in ecology and community ecology, we often call this a release. That is, these baboons were released from the impact of predation, the impact that was created through the predators that ate them and terrified them. But baboons, a bit like our friend the coyote, are incredible ecological players in the sense that they're omnivores like us. They eat plant material and they're carnivores. They eat meat as well. They eat other animals. And they're incredibly adaptable. They're able to work together in groups to solve problems, to hunt. And so all of these factors make them a very interesting or compelling candidate for understanding changes in these ecosystems. And we were very interested in understanding what does it mean for this highly adaptable, incredibly intelligent animal to suddenly be freed from the impacts of predation. And what we found, and this is just a summary graph, or just an example graph, but what we found was that as baboons increased, we saw this rapid accelerating declines of the animals that potentially could be eaten by baboons. And that's small antelope and birds and various other species that are under about 50 pounds in size. And we worked, if you're interested, we worked with National Geographic and other groups to make documentaries about the cooperative hunting behavior of baboons in these systems, to really try and capture the degree to which baboons were essentially becoming or replacing the top carnivores in these systems. And if you're interested, this is a little bit of nerdy material, But if you're familiar with isotopes, stable isotopes, if you've ever had your own diet measured through stable isotopes, you know that we can use nitrogen and carbon isotopes to try and assess where any given animal might appear on the food chain. And we use this approach to ask whether there was evidence, isotopic evidence, that baboons had actually become more carnivorous, or had actually become become meat eaters in these communities in which they occur after the loss of these other top predators. And in fact, when we compared these isotopic signatures from baboons in the same areas in the 1960s from museum specimens to 2006 through 2010, we saw a very dramatic shift in diet, which is consistent with these baboons actually changing their diet from primarily plant eaters, primarily being vegetarian, to becoming overwhelmingly carnivorous. So this is sort of a story, again, about these linkages, and in some cases illuminating these connections that we don't always appreciate between different species and groups of species. And it starts with human impacts on large carnivores, and then the loss of these large carnivores leading to this release or this eruption of baboons that then take over in these communities and have powerful effects on other smaller species, including birds. And I won't go into our bird projects and other things, but the short version is that baboons love eggs, and they will do anything for an egg. And so that's another, and the story goes on as community ecology stories always do. If you pick up the thread, you can follow it basically as long as your endurance allows. But in this case, baboons also, these increasing baboon populations spread invasive trees like the neem tree, which has natural insecticidal properties that decimate butterfly and other invertebrate populations. And of course, it goes on to affecting pollination rates and crops and other things. But in any case, the major outcomes in this system are a radically altered and diminished ecosystem as the result of losing these predators at the top. And one of the things that struck us about this, or one of our first questions was, well, this is really powerful and interesting and it feels important, but is this just limited to where we're working in West Africa? And so we engaged a network of collaborators and started to pull together population data for baboons and predators across Africa. And we were able to pull together over 60 studies and documentation of places where baboons were having similar effects in growing in population. And again, baboons are incredibly smart and adaptable. They know how to find a quick meal, and they know how to bully people when necessary. And so one of the outcomes of this incredible increase of baboons has been, of course, an associated increase in conflict with humans. And if you've had the pleasure of traveling or going on safari or other things in Africa, there's a very good chance you had a run-in with baboons at some point, because again, they are incredibly intelligent and they're quick to find an opportunity. But it's not just this sort of nuisance of baboons across Africa that's really the bigger issue, or the issues that I think are most important. It's the fact that as baboons increase and become top predators in these systems, that they're diminishing wildlife populations as a whole in ways that are affecting not only the health of these ecological communities, but also the value that that nearby communities gain from tourism or harvesting wildlife for food. And it's also critically important, I think, to recognize that baboons, in the process of being released from their predators, have become the #1 consumers of, or the pests of, crops across sub-Saharan Africa. And they're also the top predator of livestock. And so this is incredibly important. And you get a sense of how incredibly adaptable these animals are, that they're just as likely to raid your cornfield or your other crops as they are to eat, eat your goats or chickens or even cows, baby cows in many cases. But again, the story, if we allow ourselves as community ecologists to go beyond the ecological community and start thinking about the toll on humans as we're doing and thinking about crop damage and livestock damage, then we start to see other outcomes and sort of other connections that we hadn't before thought of. And so what does a community do when it is constantly losing food from its crops or losing livestock to these baboons, these, quote unquote, marauding baboon? Well, it needs to come up with a way to guard its crops. And that has created a search for cheap labor across many areas of Africa. And this is a young man or a boy who's been enlisted in Mozambique, whose his task is to sit in this field and protect it from baboons. And it's an incredibly risky job because these large male baboons can weigh 80 pounds and they're incredibly strong. And again, they're perfectly willing to take on small groups of humans. But what's also critically important is that the search for cheap labor to watch fields has led to an incredible expansion of indentured servitude, or in some cases, slavery of children who are enlisted in the process of protecting fields and livestock from baboons. And in fact, this has been written about now for the last almost 20 years about how baboons are creating a demand for child labor, and that labor specifically is to watch and protect crops and livestock, and how it's also pulling children out of school, primarily girls, out of school and into fields. And so here now we have a very striking, I think, and concrete example of how something that started with the loss of top predators has worked its way through this ecosystem and is ultimately resulting in an incredible societal injustice, which is children being put into forced labor, into very risky situations. And in some cases, nearly whole generations of girls being taken out of schools in order to deal with what is this unraveling ecological system that's created these new challenges and new costs. This is actually a little snippet from the San Francisco Chronicle, noting that 85% of school-age children in some of these areas have been pulled from schools. And this is from 17 years ago, or 18 years ago, and the situation is only worse now, I can tell you. It's not just human justice and these issues about ethics and fairness that come about or as a result of these increases in baboons, but having baboons in fields, having baboons overlapping, increasing in population and overlapping with humans also means increases the potential for the spread of diseases between these animals and humans. And in fact, because of our shared evolutionary history with primates, we're actually susceptible to many diseases from baboons, and baboons likewise are susceptible to many of our diseases and parasites. And we focused on one parasite in particular that we found was incredibly common in both baboons and local human populations, and that was hookworm. You may know that hookworm is a parasite that affects almost 1 billion people a year on our planet. So an eighth of our planet experiences a hookworm infection at least once a year. And it's a primary cause of anemia, or one of the major causes of anemia in women globally. And it creates this, you may have seen this sort of distended belly. This is a protein deficiency syndrome, often called kwashiorkor, that is exacerbated and in many cases created by hookworm infections, basically having a parasite feeding internally on blood meals. And so we were interested in trying to understand, particularly in these communities where there was almost constant need for intervention for particularly children dealing with hookworm infections, we were able to see that baboons in those same areas also experience very high prevalence of hookworm infections. And in fact, when we looked at this over space, so this point here in the middle is right along this is the interface, highest interface area between baboons and people. And we saw that nearly 100% of people and baboons tested positive for the same type of hookworm, the same strain of hookworm, where there was a high degree of overlap between baboons and people. And as you move more towards cities or away from these natural areas where baboons are prevalent, there's still a relatively high rate of hookworm infection, almost 50%. That's very likely humans transferring to humans. And then when you sample baboons that are farther away from humans, their rates are very low. So there's this high, this zone of zoonotic transmission, which is a term that unfortunately COVID has brought to our lives in ways we never wanted. But again, these are the type of areas where diseases change and spread and move between wildlife and people. So all of that is to describe, I think, as Mary put it well, an effort to include humans in thinking about how ecosystems change and how those consequences go beyond simply biodiversity, but extend into our societies, our economies, and in these very fundamental ideas of justice. And we've done a fair amount of work showing and again telling the story of these connections that go far beyond West Africa or even sub-Saharan Africa, but to really kind of try and point out that when we think about the loss of species or we think about just these disruptions in ecosystems, that this is much more than just an aesthetic or ethical problem, that we're really talking about things that challenge economies, that create conflict between people, and that have incredible costs in all forms. So I'm going to jump across continents, and this second segment is going to be real short, as you can guess, because I'm under the gun on time, and I want to make sure we have time to talk. But we're going to move across the ocean to our lovely home state here of California. And I'm going to talk for a little while here about, as I said, very new research, but I want to lay the foundation or create the context for understanding this work. And this work is really an effort to support the state and support people in dealing with the new reality of a return of a large predator, which is the wolf. And there's a lot written about this, and you may have followed it, and I'll tell you a little bit more. But again, I want to set the context for this because, of course, West Africa is not unique in having large carnivore declines. And in fact, California is way ahead in removing all of its large carnivores. We did it hundreds of years before Ghana did. And I love this quote. It's from the famous, some call the father of biogeography, Alfred Russel Wallace. And he wrote all the way back in 1859 that we live in a zoologically impoverished world from which all the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms have recently disappeared. And of course, in Wallace's mindset, he was talking about the Pleistocene extinctions, which had removed, for example, nearly all of these amazing animals occurred in what is now California. And of course, very few are left. But we could apply this same term to describe what's happened to large carnivores in California just over the last 200 years. And particularly when I say large carnivores or large predators in California, I'm talking about the grizzly bear or the California golden bear, which was the largest of all the brown bears, all the grizzly bears. We had the big one. And then mountain lions or pumas or cougars, whatever you want to, whatever your favorite, if you're from the East, maybe you call them catamounts. Is that one of their terms? Yeah. Wolves, black bears, and the jaguar, which was, and is maybe perhaps in the process of returning to California as well. And we don't often talk too much about the history of predators in California, but it really is remarkable. It was perhaps the richest the richest or highest density of large carnivores anywhere in North America. And you may know the story, and if you don't, it's an amazing story of Sir Francis Drake. This was before he was Sir, I guess, when Francis Drake in the 1579, I believe, was sailing down the coast of California, or what became California. He describes in his notebook, in his journals, that he knew that their ship, the Golden Hind, badly needed to come, to be beached, to be dragged onto a beach so that they could work on the hull of the ship. But every time Drake got close to a beach along the California coast, they would see it literally swarming with large carnivores, and particularly these massive bears that were absolutely terrifying. And Drake and his folks described bears and wolves and all sorts of terrifying things populating these beaches and eating the dead bodies of whales and elephant seals. And it was just this incredible, rich community of mostly animals that were scavenging on this amazing marine subsidy. You could imagine even just seeing these California condors, which were primarily eating dead whales and other dead sea life, seeing a bird of that size, having never seen anything close to that in Europe, must in itself have been terrifying for Drake and his crew. And so what did they do? Well, they kept going until they got to what we now call Drake's Bay and what is in the Point Reyes National Seashore today. And the reason why they were able to pull up there was because the Coast Miwok tribe had been in that area and had done their own, subtle predator control efforts. So thanks to the friendly Coast Miwok who welcomed Drake and his crew when they arrived, Drake was able to pull up on the beach and they were able to work on their boat. But as we know, so California, again, had this incredible abundance and diversity of wildlife and large predators. And like so many things, it was the gold rush and the incredible consumption of natural resources associated with that huge population increase. And also the very targeted removal of carnivores, of predators, in response to increasing livestock, and livestock that was in large part supporting gold rush and post-gold rush California. And of course, it's not that long ago. We don't have to go back too far. We can go to the late 1800s and hear stories of Californians encountering the massive golden bear of California. And this was also, of course, during this era of the incredible sort of decimation or drive to extinction of once super abundant species. We nearly drove the bison to extinction. We did drive the passenger pigeon to extinction, which of course was thought to be maybe the most abundant, certainly the most abundant bird in North America and maybe the world, with estimated population of 3 to 5 billion birds. So, and the California grizzly bear was, of course, unable to escape that same pressure, with the last California grizzly bear being removed, shot in 1908. And the wolf in California disappeared soon after. I should point out this wasn't actually the last grizzly bear. I think the last grizzly bear in California was taken in 1922. The wolf, I believe the last wolf was shot in Lassen County, removed in Lassen County in 1926 or 28. But again, it was not just this gold rush, but very intentional efforts to remove predators in California that led to a surprisingly rapid decline, and in some cases, as in the wolf and the grizzly bear, extinction in the state. And these are pretty blurry slides and they're pretty graphic. I apologize for that. But I just want to emphasize the point that it's not so much shooting animals that removed them or that had the biggest effect on their population. It was the widespread and very intentional use of poisons by the US government and the state of California to remove wildlife that really had the greatest effects. And the tide really turned for wildlife in California, particularly predators in California, when the state, and particularly starting in the 1970s, so as you probably know, California was ahead of the Endangered Species Act in passing its own Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. And in 1974, California voted to ban the payment of bounties for folks who killed wildlife. The sport hunting of mountain lions was banned in 1990. The use of leg hold traps, and very importantly, the use of poisons in killing wildlife was banned in our state in 1998. A ban on the use of dogs in hunting, which profoundly impacted bears and mountain lions, went into effect in 2012. It took until 2014 for California to ban wildlife killing contests, but those are banned now for 9 years. You may have seen in the news when in 2015, bobcat hunting was banned. And then more recently, several counties in California have stopped working with the agency in the federal government, the Wildlife Services Agency, that actually manages the removal, particularly of problematic animals, including predators. So many counties in California have just said, we will no longer pay money to the federal government to remove wildlife. We'll deal with it on our own. So all of these legislative actions have led to an astounding recovery of large animals in California. And just to give you an example of how fast this has happened, in 1980, there were 21 total reported sightings of mountain lions across our state in only 2 counties. And if we jump ahead to this year, we already have more than 9,000 reports. And that's probably just scratching the surface, because today we have more than 200 mountain lion sightings in Tilden Park alone. So we've had more sightings in, let's say, Berkeley and Oakland Hills than we had across the state 20 years ago. We can't even keep track anymore of coyote sightings or coyote conflict issues. Black bears are estimated to be increasing across the state at about 10% a year. And then we know from camera trap studies, remember those camera traps, that we have in many areas of California now more of these intermediate sized carnivores than anywhere else in the Western US. So these changes in policy have been hugely effective, and they've created these conditions for this recovery or this return. And I probably don't have to show you, I could show you hundreds of different maps and data sets and things to try and hammer this home. But many of you may have actually seen mountain lions, or pumas as we call them. There are thousands of sightings now in the Bay Area every year. We have all sorts of estimated population growth of black bears. We have black bears showing up in Marin County, in townships like San Anselmo, and getting into trash and other things where they have not been recorded in the last several generations. And of course, we're never far from it. We have sightings every few weeks around the Berkeley campus. I am often brought in to evaluate. We have scratch marks from mountain lions on the trees on the campus. So they're coming down at night. So it's all around us. But of course, these large predators are coming back to a California that is very unlike the one that they knew in multiple generations ago. And of course, we now have almost 40 million Californias, whereas when species like grizzly bears and wolves were extirpated from the state, we had more like 1.5 million people. So it's a very different California with a lot more people and a lot more pets. And that means a lot more conflict. And this is all around us. And this is the coyotes versus cats situation in many of our urban areas today. And it's not just our pets, but livestock producers in California also face pressure from predators that they haven't experienced, again, in multiple generations, in some cases in more than 100 years. And of course, we're seeing increases in direct conflict between people and wildlife, including attacks by mountain lions on hikers and joggers and other types of issues. And so what we have is a new world, a new challenge for the interaction of these large carnivores and humans, roadways and hiking trails and animals that are quickly coming into our urban spaces. And why are they coming into our urban spaces? Why not stay outside of these urban spaces? Well, many of you know, I'll skip that, but many of you face this in your backyards all the time, is that our urban spaces are home to prey, and in these cases, wolf and mountain lion prey. And so this is our new reality. And in this new reality, or this is the context in which wolves have come back to California just in the last 10 years. Many of us thought we wouldn't see wolf recovery in our lifetimes. And now the question is, how many thousands of wolves will there be in our lifetimes? Because they're here, they're moving, they're reproducing. If you follow the news, you know that even in the last 2 months, we've moved from 4 estimated packs of wolves in the state to 8 packs, including now a pack in Sequoia National Forest. So we're now rapidly moving towards Southern California. The wolf story, which I'll jump through super fast, is just one that started in late 2011 with the enterprising wolf known as OR7, who traveled from Oregon and traveled through the state. We now think that there were probably wolves here before, but they had stayed under the radar and there were very few of them. As I said, the most recent pack now, 12 years after that first individual, we have what we think is our 7th or 8th pack, which is this southern pack of wolves, which is very interesting and exciting and a little bit scary at how fast they're spreading. In fact, wolves cover incredible amounts of ground. And that is, I guess, from one perspective, very good if you're talking about recovery, in that they can move across the state. They can cover 100 miles in a day, and they can move from the Sierras to the coastal range or other things. But if you're trying to manage wolves and manage challenges that wolves create, that's an incredible risk. And this is just a quote from a rancher, a very thoughtful rancher who's working very hard to raise cattle and sheep in a way that will reduce conflict with wolves. But as she points out, they move across the landscape like wind. They cover huge distances. They'll never turn down an easy meal, so they'll take livestock if it's available to them. And across California, they are taking livestock. And they really don't care whether they're in a national park, whether they're on private land, whether they're in a state park. None of that matters. They're looking for habitat and they're looking for food. So I'm now down to my last couple slides here. And I'll just wanted to introduce, as I said, very new work, which is an effort in partnership with my colleague, Professor Arthur Middleton, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and many other collaborators, which is really endeavoring to do some of the first very in-depth work on the science of wolves in California. That is, to put GPS collars on wolves and to better understand where they're moving, what they're eating, and where and how they're getting into trouble with people. But also working with the state and producers and stakeholders to try and implement thoughtful compensation programs that help people both prepare for the impacts wolves will have on livestock and the risks they'll cause to communities in ways that we hope will foster this golden goal of coexistence. So I've kind of flown through both of these examples. And I guess my general point is we've seen sort of stories of decline and stories of recovery, and they're both complex, and they both have challenges associated with them. As a community ecologist, I firmly believe that predators and large carnivores are essential to healthy ecosystems. And by a healthy ecosystem, I mean one that benefits people, that helps regulate disease, that helps ensure that we have opportunities for recreation and other forms of human nature interactions. But I am the last one to, I don't want to underemphasize how complicated it is to have large carnivores back in our lives, in many cases, even in our cities. So with that, I'll stop. I'll just say quickly, keep an eye out if you get Breakthroughs magazine. There's a wonderful story coming out in the next edition about our wildlife program here at Berkeley and some of our new hires and new energy and some of these projects and perspectives. And so there we are, standing awkwardly in the eucalyptus grove. That was the photographer's idea, but there you have it. So please look out for that and read it and send any questions. And with that, again, I want to acknowledge the students and postdocs and other folks who are really, I think, the brilliant energy behind so much of what we do on campus.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all very much.